I've got a few things I want to talk about today. We'll see how they come together. I thought we could start off by looking at a verse. It's from the Gita. Atma aupam yena sarvatra samam pashyati yo Arjuna. So, yo, one who, pashyati, sees, samam, the same. That's where you get the English word same from. It's from the Sanskrit, sama. So, yo pashyati samam, one who sees the same, sarvatra, everywhere. Atma aupam yena. Upaman, Sanskrit means comparison. And so aupam yena means by comparing. Atma to oneself. One who sees the same everywhere by comparing things to oneself. One who sees the same everywhere by comparing things to oneself. Even a literal translation to English still leaves this verse somewhat enigmatic. One who sees the same everywhere by comparing things to oneself. Sukham va yadi dukham va. Whether in happiness or in distress. Sayogi paramo mataha. That yogi is considered to be, that person is considered to be the greatest yogi. Sa, that person, yogi paramo mataha, is considered to be the greatest. Parama means greatest. Mataha means considered. Sa yogi paramo mataha. And there's a use the word yaha, one who does this, that person is this. So one who sees the same everywhere by comparing things to oneself, whether in their happiness or in their distress, that very person is the greatest yogi. Even as we're translating it, I'm thinking it still seems pretty abstruse, pretty complex, pretty difficult to discern exactly what's being said. What do you guys think the verse means? One who sees the same everywhere by comparing things to oneself, whether in happiness or whether things are happy or sad, that person is the greatest yogi. Mace.
I think it's saying that even if things are hard or easy, good or bad, you shouldn't forget your true nature, so that when you compare everything else to yourself, you'll see the same, and you won't be so easily to judge people.
Okay. So, one who sees the same everywhere, whether it's happy or sad, is what you just said. You don't get too hung up on whether things are up or down, or happy or sad, or left or right. You stay zen, and you stay calm and composed. The problem with that accurate statement is it ignores the first two words of the verse. Atma aupam yena, by comparing it to oneself. Those words don't fit with what you just said. We can get rid of those words. If you see the same everywhere, whether it's good or bad, happy or sad, you're the greatest yogi. The rest of the verse works perfectly and flows with what you're saying. But the statement, by the act of comparing it with yourself, that's the red herring that doesn't fit. You want to respond?
Would it work better if our
Well, I see you. Give me a sec. Can you raise your hand? Chill. I got you. I see you. No, I'm going to answer him. I'm going to respond to him. Then I'm going to call on you in a sec. I'm going to respond to him first. Just let me finish with him. Thank you. So, you moved, and now we're not looking at the world, whether it's good or bad, happy or sad, equally, but we're looking at ourselves. Because you're trying to fit those first couple words in by comparing it to yourself. The problem with that is that it says you see everything. And so now you limited the scope of the verse to just looking at your own situation. But the verse says sarvatra, in all circumstances when you're looking at anything. So you limited the verse to now just looking at your own situation, which is myopic and which goes against that word sarvatra. You're looking at everything like this and everyone like this. Did you follow that? How do you solve that? Okay. All right. What's your name?
My name is Marielle.
Marielle, what you got?
I'm really trying to follow the other language. I hear you translating, but the gist of it, I think maybe if you just keep your consciousness on Krishna, then maybe wherever you are, however you feel, if you just center yourself on the consciousness, the divine consciousness, then you'll be good all the time. You'll be fine all the time. It's like ever new energy and joy, maybe.
Thank you, Marielle. Really appreciate that. I really appreciate you jumping in and thinking about it. I really like what you said, too. I really like what you said. Okay. Dom, what do you got?
I think it's a verse about empathy where you see everyone is sharing the same nature as yourself. And so the more that you're able to see yourself as a spiritual being, also a physical, emotional, mental being, you see all those different layers are also present in other people, whether they're happy or they're sad. We're all just kind of revolving within that sphere of yourself, and that person is the best of it.
I don't know what that means, sphere of the self. You got a little
Within the, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical.
Okay. I like what you said about empathy, which was a missing ingredient in what you said, Mace. The verse obviously is about empathy, about thinking about other people the same way you think about yourself. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The golden rule, the categorical imperative, this idea of treat others as you'd like to be treated. Be considerate towards others as you'd like people to be considerate towards you. Take other people's feelings into consideration as you'd like them to take your feelings into consideration. This idea is being espoused. And amazingly, this idea is being then the defining feature of the self-realized soul is this radical empathy. So I want to talk about empathy for a minute, and then we're going to flip it. What's the opposite of empathy?
Indifference.
Apathy.
It's interesting. It's a good question, right? I'm sorry, what'd you say? The opposite of empathy, we can look at what the word... Empathy is a recent word in English. It's only been around since 1908. And so it's a really recent term. Came out of German. And it means to feel into someone. Pathos means to feel. And so if you say you have empathy, it means you feel into someone. Sympathy means you feel with someone. Compassion means you suffer with someone. The word passion is linked to Christ and his crucifixion, by the way. And passion means suffering. It means something different in English now, but the original usage of the term passion was suffering. So compassion is to suffer with someone. Sympathy, to feel with someone. Empathy, to feel into someone. And so empathy is to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And walk a mile in their shoes. There's a famous story about a rabbi and his acolyte, his apprentice. And so the rabbi was sitting there and he was meeting with people, and they would talk to him all day and he would give them advice. And he was just sitting behind his desk at the synagogue in his office, just talking to people throughout the day. And his disciple noticed he was sweating profusely. But it wasn't a hot day, and they were just sitting there doing nothing. He said, "Why are you sweating so much?" He said, "I'm exhausted. I've been working really hard." And the student was confused. "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, somebody comes into my office, and they tell me their problems. So I have to take off my clothes, and I have to put on their clothes to understand their problem. But then if I just wear their clothes, I can't help them. So I have to quickly take off their clothes and put my clothes back on so that I can give them advice. And all this getting undressed and putting on their clothes and taking them off and putting my clothes back on is exhausting. I've been working really hard all day." So empathy is to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That is different definition. But in the word empath, you ever heard that people say I'm an empath? That term comes from a 1956 Scottish science fiction novel. So that's only been around for a real short period of time. The empath just kind of walks around the world, taking on other people's feelings. And that became popularized in the 1968 Star Trek episode called The Empath, about a woman who took on the feelings of whoever was suffering around her. And so the word empath, when people say I'm an empath, it means they're borrowing from this 1968 episode of Star Trek and applying it to themselves. Which is just way less sexy and cool than how they're trying to front when they say that. When people say I'm an empath, a lot of times what they're really saying is, I'm so unbelievably sensitive, get back. I don't want to deal with any of your garbage. It's all about me, because I am such a special person that you don't have a right to feel or talk about your feelings, because I'm just this superhero that takes everything on, and so I have a right to be a bold-faced narcissist in all circumstances. And then euphemistically dress it up as being an empath. Anyway, empathy, sometimes they talk about empathy as being to avoid a feeling for someone. And so you don't feel with them, you feel into them, so you could theoretically be a sociopath, figure out how people feel, and then use that to con them or manipulate them. Sometimes that seems a downside of empathy. Whereas sympathy, you feel with somebody, but you don't actually feel into them, so you don't know what they need. And so you might give them exactly the wrong thing for what they need. And then a lot of times compassion is thought of as being the perfect balance of sympathy and empathy. Of course, these terms are defined by different theorists in different ways, and so I'm just giving you some of the more standard definitions. But compassion is when you want to help someone, and you know how to help them. And so you're with them, but you're also able to help them through what they're going through. Also, sometimes compassion is thought of as being love towards someone who's suffering. And the basic sentiment of love, then applied to someone who's in a suffering condition, manifests as compassion or empathy. And so it's a basic positive feeling of love and affection. But when a person who has love and affection for someone else who's in a difficult circumstance, then that's called compassion. Sometimes people say God's compassion for us, which means God's love for us when we're suffering, is grace. Anyway, you can get into defining different kinds of compassion, but we're gonna stick with empathy. So I like to think of empathy as good projection. If you get accused of projecting onto someone else, then what you're doing, psychologically speaking, is you are unable to own your own existential feelings in a given circumstance. And these feelings are too big for you to process. They're just too much for you to own up to. You're too immature to be in touch with how you feel. And so you project your feeling onto someone else. So you'll accuse somebody of trying to cheat you. But in fact, you were trying to cheat them, and you end up viewing them as trying to cheat you. Or you're racist, and you view other people as being racist. Or you're selfish, but then you always think, oh, they're all being selfish. But if you were to objectively analyze what's going on, you're the one being selfish. And it sounds bizarre that you would blame someone else for the exact thing you're guilty of. It seems like it would require some kind of a temporary lobotomy. But in fact, this is so common that it happens in almost every therapy session. Right? And then you got to point it out. You help people get in touch with their feelings, admit their feelings to themselves, stop projecting their issue onto somebody else. But there's no way to empathize with someone if you haven't had any life experience. That's why children are all narcissistic. Because they're just building up their own experience of life and just getting started, and they haven't gotten to a place where they can springboard off of it and start to feel for other people. If I want to empathize with you and walk a mile in your shoes and understand where you're coming from, I have to have my own life experience that I can then project onto you to try to work out what it is you're saying to me, what it is you're trying to communicate, what it is you're trying to feel. And the only way to do that is to project and liken what you're going through to what I've been through. Sometimes you can jump with it a little bit. You know, maybe somebody's addicted to alcohol. You've never been addicted to alcohol. You're trying to understand what they're going through. So you got to think, well, have I ever been addicted to anything? Like, oh, I used to be like crazy addicted to video games. And then you extrapolate from that. You try and put yourself in their shoes and get a sense of what they're talking about. That to have a compulsion that you can't control. And you lose some of your freedom because you get these massive dopamine and oxytocin hits and this massive serotonin modulation. You feel compelled, you're up all night playing video games, and you see somebody bar crawling, you're like, you start to get a second, I haven't done that, but I did this. And then I can start to think about what you must be going through. So empathy really is successful projection sensitive, successful, philanthropic projection, where you start to take your own life experience and you use that to be able to step into someone else's shoes and feel with them, and feel for them, and understand them. Now, the true opposite of empathy is callousness or apathy. Literally, the exact opposite of apathy, to not feel for someone, is the exact opposite of feeling into them, would be to not feel for them at all. So apathy, callousness, disinterest, disregard. I think everybody got it. When I asked for definitions, a number of people said a number of things. They all had this. It's a lack of feeling for someone. And I do think that's a true antonym for empathy. But I want to pick like a more dangerous antonym for empathy today. And I want to use empathy more or less synonymous with compassion. This positive projection that's done with someone's best interest in mind. So some theorists, like I said, say a sociopath could empathize with you in order to exploit you. But I'm using the term empathy really for compassion. So Dom said empathy, but I'm just going to go ahead and use the word compassion. We can use empathy, but I mean compassion. I mean this feeling for someone, with them, stepping into their shoes, with love, with affection, caring for them the same way you would care for yourself. Does that make sense? And I'm picking as an antonym for that today, although the true antonym would be callousness. But I'm thinking I'm looking for a hot antonym, an antonym which is not devoid of feeling and purely neutral. So what's the antonym for empathy if you still have feeling? And the antonym is?
I was going to say envy.
You were going to say it. So what do you want to say instead of it? I'm sorry?
Envy.
Okay. Because you say I was going to say it, means you chose not to.
I'm not 100% about it.
I'm thinking it's envy. I'm thinking it's envy. Which for today's discussion, we're going to define as the inability to tolerate the eminence of another. The inability to tolerate the eminence of another, which is that's a 500-year-old definition from our own tradition about matsarya, which is enviousness in Sanskrit. There's a number of words for envy, but one of them is matsarya. The inability to tolerate the good qualities, the success, the eminence of another person. Now, who experiences envy on a regular basis? Raise your hand. Everyone who didn't raise their hand is a liar. But here's the deal. You may be lying to yourself. It's possible you're just so immature and delusional about your own state of existence that you're sincere. I don't mean that you're being willfully duplicit. But if you didn't raise your hand, please know that you are wrong. Schopenhauer said that envy is this universal emotion that no one will admit to experiencing. Something everybody experiences that no one ever talks about. I think the hot, emotional antonym of empathy/compassion is envy. Where instead of positively projecting onto someone else, feeling with them, and feeling for them, and honoring them enough to walk a mile in their shoes, you hate them for their good qualities. And you rejoice in their suffering. And what it really is is it's a complete lack of putting yourself in their shoes. And I wanted to unpack envy a little bit. And I also wanted to point out a cure for envy. And given that all of us experience envy on a regular basis, finding a cure for it is good. If you envy someone, you're objectifying them. You're not really seeing them as a person. You're not deeply stepping into their world and walking a mile in their shoes. What you're usually doing is you're taking a couple of highlights. You're taking a couple of highlights. Kathy, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's your 13-year-old son, right? Who must be bored out of his skull. Why don't you grab him and take him in there and see if there's some other kids around. They might have all split, or they might be watching the UFC or playing video games. Why don't you grab my guy, take him in there? It's just in the other room. We're not like taking him to like another. We're not taking him to a dungeon or anything like that. Yeah. And if there's not, you can bring him back. But otherwise, set him up.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. I empathize with your kid. That's what just happened there. I hadn't done the arithmetic, and all of a sudden you were kind of just like petting his head or something like that. He was like laying down in your lap, and I was like, "Oh, wait a second, that's your kid." And I thought, I would hate being in this class if I was 13. Anyway, that was real time empathy. We'll see if we get him. If he comes out and he's like, "I hate these people now," and those guys were way worse in here than it wasn't perfect. When you envy someone, I don't believe you're actually viewing them as a person. I think what's really happening is you're taking a highlight reel, a shallow highlight reel of a couple things about them, like, Ashish's hair. You follow? It's like just like one item somebody has that you find to be noteworthy, or somebody else's bank balance, or somebody else's height, or somebody else's cheekbone structure, or the fullness of their lips, the shape of their eyes, or their position in society, or their fame, or their influence over other people, or their personal strength, or their endurance, or their capacity for violence, or the length of their wingspan of their arms. That's a significant one in boxing. Most people don't think of like how long are your arms, but as soon as you get into pugilism, the length of your opponent's arms, it determines the entirety of the fight. I guess it didn't work out. See? There's nothing going on there? All right, cool. See? I failed. Don't get any credit. Well, if he comes again, if you ever come again, we'll catch at the beginning, and then we'll hook him up with the kids. And if they roll over to my restaurant, he can go with them, and they'll feed him. Or if they'll get into a video game thing, he can be front and center for that. I think what we do when we envy people is we take a little shallow snapshot of some aspect of them that is impressive. You follow? And then we compare and of course it's usually something that you're not so good at. Or sometimes it's something that you're semi-good at and they're just better. It goes either way. You can even be great at it and they're just greater. There's a meme going on Instagram right now that it's like a mother's talking to her son. She says, "Son, don't compare yourself to other people. There's always someone who's better or badder, or stronger or tougher." And he says, "No, Mom, that's not true. Somebody's got to be the baddest. Somebody's got to be the toughest." That there is one ring to rule them all, and somebody gets to claim the heavyweight champion of the world, or the strongest man in the world, or whatever it might be. Anyways, in some ways it's inspiring because it indicates you should strive for absolute perfection in what you're doing, and not just embrace this, I'm going to fail, I can't be the fastest, the strongest, the smartest, and actually just go for it. And don't put a limitation on it. But yeah, you could be really good at something, and then you just meet somebody who's better. And that you could be rich, and you meet somebody who's richer, and you feel like really insignificant. Or you're super beautiful, and then you walk into a room of ridiculously super beautiful people, and all of a sudden you're the ugly duckling, and you're like, what am I doing? I should kill myself right now. Or you're strong, and then you just happen to walk into a den of insanely strong people, and all of a sudden you're the low man on the totem pole. Or, just running with this strength thing because it's easy. Strength is so measurable, It's such a measurable thing. You put weight on a bar, and how can you lift it like this? It gets real easy to measure. I mean, people cheat with their form and stuff like that, but at least if you have some kind of dignity and you compare apples to apples and you have strict form, you can really measure people's strength. So sometimes you got a great bench press, for example, but then somebody else has a great squat, and so even though you have a great bench press, as soon as you see them squatting, you're envious. You lose your ability. Or you might try to twist the conversation or the workout over the chest work to show them up. But it's envy, just manifested in a manipulative way. You guys follow this? They're better than me at that. Okay, so we're going to make the whole thing about this so I can get over on them, so I don't show my weak link. So however you cope with it, that's another conversation. But I'm introducing a theory that envy is shallow. It's a shallow snapshot of looking at a highlight reel in someone else and then comparing somebody's best qualities oftentimes to your worst. And a lot of times you'll even collect a bunch of people's best qualities and then compare them to all the things you struggle with. And it's the opposite, as far as I can see, of the golden rule of treating others as you have them treat you, of comparing people to yourself in a positive way, of empathy, because you're not really looking at that person as a person. You're looking at them in a very, very objectified way as just one shallow quality that they have. And the cure for envy is purposeful empathy, where you look at the people you're engaged with as actual people with a whole life, with the capacity for love and struggles and existential crises and hopes and dreams and disappointments and trauma and pain and sadness and beauty and the capacity for love and hope and joy. And you look at them as they are instead of in a super shallow, objectifying way where you just look at 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 of their qualities and try to sever them from the actual person. And if you do that, instead of being envious of them, you will be inspired by them. You may even follow in their footsteps. You'll appreciate them because you'll see their good qualities as part of a composite whole person. The ability to do that depends on you having done that with yourself. That's why empathy depends on your own experience of life that you then project onto other people. And so you need to look at your own life and everything about yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, where they came from. Your strengths came from resilience combined with trauma, oftentimes, most of the time. The fine things you have about yourself that make you special oftentimes were an early response in your childhood to some particular trauma or struggle, and you learned how to adapt and overcome it. It became a character strength. And so, if you can look at yourself and your glories and faults dispassionately, objectively, not delusionally, in a mature way, and look at what you're good at, what you're not so good at, where you need work, where you are susceptible to being triggered and being reactive. Really know yourself. And look at what got you where you are. All that stuff that happened when you were a kid that largely made you into who you are. That largely gave you your good and bad qualities. Colored the way you look at the world. In some ways determine what you're going to do for a career. And be happy at. If you've done that with yourself, then you can do that with other people. And you can meet somebody and you can really get to know them and see them for who they are. And when you do that, you find that everybody has the same basic architecture as you. They had traumatic events, they had struggles, they overcame those struggles with remarkable resilience. They cultivate a certain quality, they have certain deficiencies. To some extent, those pushings are not under their control. Their early experiences sculpted their later life. For every good quality they have, there's a corresponding pain or trauma or suffering that they underwent, that good quality or good activity was a response to and an attempt to overcome. And once you see somebody impressive, strong, famous, brilliant, rich, powerful, influential, beautiful, but you see them as a whole person instead of a couple of highlights in a shallow snapshot. You see them as a whole person, and you see where that stuff came from, knowing that they have a similar architecture to yourself, and everything about them kind of came from their attempts to cope with this world. You'll never envy them. Because you'll see them as a grab bag of good and bad qualities. And you'll see your own life. And you'll also see that you're a grab bag of different qualities, but the ones you have are special and unique to you. And you wouldn't trade them for the world. And you accept. I was dealt a certain hand by the deck of life. I played that hand in a certain way. And although there's room for me to have regrets and remorse and want to do things differently, and I could have done a better job, the basic structure of my life that's given me who I am and how I see the world, I'm not willing to give it up. Because there's some real special stuff in there, and that stuff is mine. It's unique to me. And I can't trade my one quality for their one quality. I'd have to actually swap out our lives because our qualities were built through our experience. And I'm not willing to do that because this is my hand. This is me. We usually take our worst qualities and compare them to somebody else's, or some shallow thing, but we forget that all that stuff is tied to our own experience and the good and bad and joy and sorrow of our life that ultimately you wouldn't really want to trade for somebody else's. What you kind of want to do is just trade their bank balance for yours. You follow? But their bank balance comes along with their bleeding ulcer. Their bank balance comes along with their abusive parents who they inherited the money from. Their beauty comes along with that rape they had to suffer. Their strength comes along with the abuse they suffered as a small child that their strength was a response to. And once you start connecting those dots, objectification is over. You're seeing them as a real person, and envy dissipates and evaporates like it was never there. And what you're left with is understanding and compassion and appreciation and all sorts of really positive reactions to the amazing people you meet in the world. So the verse is about this greatest yogi, Sa Yogi Paramo Mata. This person is considered to be the greatest yogi. Who? Yahas Pashyati Savasha, one who sees everywhere, samam, the same, Atma Alpam Yena, by comparing it to himself. And amazingly, this verse, the way I've interpreted it, doesn't actually require you to be a fully self-realized soul. The same that you see could be that you're all souls, children of God. The same could also be that everybody has pain. The same also could be that everybody has joy. The same could also be that everybody has trauma. And so this idea of you seeing the same, this is like a rabbit hole that can grow with you. And even before you're self-realized, even before you have a deep and profound concept of self and the soul, this idea is there because just based on whatever your experience of your life is, you're starting to relate that to other people and see that they're not that different and they're like you and they've got the same hopes and dreams and feelings. And even as an atheist, theoretically, you could see, oh, they suffered like I have, they've been through things like I have, but it starts this like deepening process where you're viewing things for what they are, and at some point when you're starting to look at the world in a non-objectified way, you start to notice this radical thing called consciousness that is impossible to explain away chemically as derivative of electrochemical states in the brain. You start to encounter things like free will, the capacity to feel, the capacity to love, thoughts about other things, the things that are intrinsic to our consciousness that we simply don't find in the chemical world. And so as you start to radically look at your life and look at yourself in a deeper way, it allows you to look at other people in a deeper way. Even if it's not starting with spirituality, eventually you start to uncover consciousness. And then that compassion, that empathy, that solution to envy gets multiplied exponentially. And you have way, way deeper ways in which you can relate to people and feel for people and love people and care for people as souls, not just as a body. And even you meet a sociopath, you can appreciate them. You good? You want to go? It's your time to go? Okay, I just want to make sure you weren't leaving. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here too. Have a great night. And then you can start to appreciate people on a whole different level. You meet a sociopath or some extremely cruel person, you can ultimately understand they're also a spiritual being. And at least feel compassion and love and empathy for them on that level, simply because they're a conscious self. irrespective of their behavior. And so I think in this verse, empathy and compassion is a very strong feature of the verse, which is why I critiqued your initial answer, Mace, because you missed it. You did a great rendition of the verse. There was like a gaping hole because you missed the actual core of the verse. You got all the accoutrements of the verse, but you missed the core, the main course, which is why I pushed you. I think this verse is about empathy and compassion. I think it's the cure for envy. I think it allows you to interface with people in this world without getting into a really negative space. I think it leads to self-realization because it's a deepening of the way you look at the world and the way you look at other people, which will eventually lead you to going deep enough that you start to look at consciousness and do the math and realize that consciousness can't come from chemicals. Chemicals don't have free will, even if you mix a bunch of them up. Chemicals don't have thoughts about other chemicals. And you start to look at these insuperable problems of a mechanistic description of consciousness and the uniqueness and fundamental nature of consciousness, which then gives you all the more reason to empathize with people, in some ways independent of what they're doing with their life. And you can feel love and empathy and compassion for people you don't even know. You have nothing in common with from anywhere in the world, maybe even animals who feel pain just like you do, have the same C neuron fibers you have. That's what I got today. Thank you, IGTV. You guys got any feedback for me?